Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. It was a cold, silent evening when I found myself alone in a cabin tucked deep within the woods. I hadn't intended to be there for long, just a weekend retreat to clear my mind, disconnect from the digital chaos and give myself space to think. The cabin belonged to a distant cousin who rarely used it, and he was kind enough to lend it to me for a few days. As the sun dipped behind the tall trees, the golden light gave way to a heavy darkness that wrapped itself around the structure. The wind whispered through the forest with a strange rhythm, and the creaks of the old wood seemed to match the pulse of my breathing. The inside of the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and damp stone. I set my bag down, lit the fireplace, and made myself a cup of tea, hoping to settle into the eerie quiet that surrounded me. The night fell quickly, and I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. Beyond them, nothing but pitch black wilderness stretched in all directions. No phone signal, no neighbors for miles, just me and the sounds of the forest. Around 10 p.m. I started hearing something that didn't match the usual nighttime rustling. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew steadily louder, footsteps crunching through dry leaves. Not fast or erratic, just steady, measured, like someone walking in circles around the cabin. I turned off the lights and sat motionless, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, or even a bear. But those footsteps sounded too deliberate, too human. I stepped softly toward the window and pulled the curtain back just a sliver. Nothing but black trees and shadows greeted me. I must have stood there for 10 minutes, staring into that void, waiting for movement. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, and silence returned. I tried to laugh it off, told myself I was just getting spooked by the isolation. I climbed into bed upstairs, bringing the fireplace's warmth with me in my thick sweater. Sleep, however, refused to come. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I hadn't remembered falling asleep, but something had startled me awake, a sound. Not from outside this time, but from within the cabin itself. A soft thud, then another. I sat up in bed and listened. It was coming from the first floor. My heart raced as I tried to recall if I'd locked the door, but I couldn't remember. I tiptoed out of bed and crept toward the stairs, every step an agony of creaks and groans beneath my feet. Peering down into the darkness, I could just barely make out the silhouette of the living room. The fire had died, leaving only glowing embers. I strained my ears and caught the sound again, closer now. Something, or someone, was moving downstairs. I backed away slowly, then froze as the unmistakable creak of the first step echoed up toward me. It was being climbed, one deliberate footstep at a time. The silence between each creak was louder than the sound itself, filled with anticipation and dread. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I simply stood there, paralyzed by fear as the invisible intruder continued climbing toward me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Nothing, not even the sound of breath. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I flipped the hallway light switch and shouted, "Who's there?" My voice cracked from tension, barely sounding human. No reply. The staircase was empty. I descended slowly, checking every corner, every door, even under the furniture. No sign of anyone. The front door was locked. The windows closed. Nothing was broken. I told myself it must have been a dream, a hallucination brought on by isolation and stress, but deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning I packed up early, too shaken to stay another night. I left the cabin with the unease still clinging to me like mist, But that wasn't the end of it. When I returned home and unpacked my things, I found something that didn't belong to me. At the bottom of my bag was a note, folded and yellowed with time. There was no handwriting on the outside. I opened it, hands trembling. Inside, written in tight, faded cursive, were the words, "I see you." That was it. No name, no explanation, just a message left in my belongings written on a piece of paper I had never seen before. I thought about all the possibilities. Maybe someone had planted it before I arrived. Maybe it was a sick joke left by my cousin, though it didn't match his character. Or maybe, somehow someone had gotten inside that cabin during the night. I tried to forget it, but the experience stayed with me. A few months later, out of curiosity, or maybe foolishness, I decided to ask my cousin if he had ever experienced anything strange there. He went quiet for a long moment before simply saying, "Yeah, I don't go up there anymore." Now that was all he said. No further explanation, no elaboration, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't the first person to hear footsteps circling that cabin in the dark. I wasn't the first to be awakened by sounds that had no source. And I certainly wasn't the first to leave that place with something they didn't bring. I thought I could shake the memory, that it would fade over time like all intense emotions eventually do. But the strange thing is, the more I try to forget, the more I feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes at night, I'll hear faint footsteps outside my window, even though I live on the 3rd floor. I tell myself it's just my imagination, a leftover fear clinging to the edges of sleep. But deep down, I know better. There's a presence that never really left me after that trip. It follows, silently, lingering just at the edge of awareness. And every now and then, when I'm alone and the house is dark and quiet, I'll find little things out of place. A chair slightly turned, a book I don't remember moving, a cabinet left ajar. They're always small, almost dismissible details, but together they form a pattern I can't ignore. It's like someone is letting me know they're still there, still watching, still waiting. I try to keep my mind grounded in the ordinary, cling to the routines of everyday life, but no matter how far I go, I can never outrun the sense that something followed me home from that forest. The cabin is still there, nestled in the trees, abandoned and untouched. My cousin refuses to sell it, but no one visits. Nature has begun to reclaim it, the roof slowly sinking, the porch sagging, moss creeping up the walls. Sometimes I wonder if the cabin itself is the source, a kind of anchor for whatever it is that dwells there. Or maybe it's the land, older than any of us, carrying with it a memory of things not meant to be disturbed. And you used to think horror was something that lived in stories and dreams, but now I understand it's quieter than that. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just watches and waits and leaves notes where you least expect them. Story 2. I was 17 when I took a summer job as a night janitor at an old public library on the edge of town. The building had been there for over a century, its architecture a crumbling mix of Victorian and Gothic influences, and most of its charm lay in its eeriness. It wasn't heavily used anymore. Most people preferred the newer, more modern library downtown, but the city refused to tear it down, calling it a historic landmark. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I looked forward to the quiet. All I had to do was vacuum the main floors, dust the reading rooms, and check that all windows and doors were secured before locking up. It sounded easy enough, and it was, for the first week. The silence became something I could almost relax into, the rhythm of cleaning oddly meditative. That is, until I started noticing things weren't quite as still as they seemed. Eco began, with books being out of place. At first I chalked it up to absent-mindedness. Maybe I had knocked something loose or overlooked a shelf. But they weren't just fallen books. They were specific, always old volumes, always from the same section, folklore and the occult. titles about spirits, rituals, possessions. At the end of one shift, I distinctly remembered reshelving everything neatly, but when I returned the next night, several of those books were back on the reading table. I asked the daytime staff if they'd moved anything. They swore they hadn't. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence or maybe an error in communication, but the unease crept in like a slow fog, the kind of feeling that doesn't alarm you at once, but settles into your bones, convincing you something isn't right. Then came the cold spots. There was one aisle, tall and narrow, with shelves that blocked the overhead light just enough to create a permanent gloom that always felt colder than the rest of the building. I didn't think much of it until I noticed how I could see my breath when walking through it, even in July. The air felt heavier there, like it resisted being disturbed. One night I dropped my keys while walking through that aisle and bent down to pick them up. Just as my fingers touched the metal, I heard a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't a word exactly, more like the sound of breath shaping a syllable. I shot up, heart pounding, and spun around. No one. I stood frozen for a long minute listening. The library was silent once more. I told myself it was wind or a pipe groaning, but deep down, I didn't believe that anymore. On another shift, I noticed that the reading room door, which I always left slightly ajar, was fully closed. It wasn't locked, just closed tightly. I reached out and pushed it open. The room was dark, as expected, but the air inside felt different. Stale, charged, like a storm waiting to break. I walked in slowly, shining my flashlight across the long wooden tables and antique chairs. Then I saw them, the same books, arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, all open to different pages. I didn't even check which ones. I just gathered them quickly and reshelved them, trying to calm my racing heart. That night, I locked up early and sat in my car for over an hour before driving home. I didn't tell anyone. I was scared they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they would. After that, things escalated. I began hearing footsteps, not the soft scurrying of mice or the occasional creak of wood settling. These were firm, deliberate steps. They echoed across the marble floors of the second level, the balcony that overlooked the main lobby. I would hear them above me, even though I knew I was the only one in the building. I once called out, "Hello?" just to hear the sound of my own voice. No answer came. Just silence, and then more footsteps. I tried ignoring it. I blasted music through my earbuds. I moved faster through my tasks, but the footsteps always returned, each time sounding a little closer, a little bolder, like something was testing the limits of how far it could go without being seen. Then came the night I saw it. I was in the archive room, the farthest part of the library and the oldest. The lights there flickered constantly, and the scent of mildew hung heavy in the air. I turned the corner into the aisle that led to the microfiche machines and saw something at the end. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the poor lighting. But it didn't move like a shadow. It was tall, thin, and human-shaped, but it didn't stand like a person. He slouched slightly forward, and his limbs looked too long, like it had been stretched. I froze. My flashlight flickered, and in that strobe-like flicker it seemed to twitch closer, as though it moved only when I wasn't watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't walk. I ran. I didn't even finish my shift. I left the lights on, locked the doors, and sped home without looking back. The next morning I got a call from the head librarian. She asked if I'd noticed anything strange recently. I hesitated, then admitted I had. Her voice dropped. She told me I wasn't the first. Apparently janitors didn't last more than a few weeks in that building. Most left without explanation. Some claimed to have seen things. One even left mid-shift and never returned to pick up their paycheck. I asked why they didn't close the library if it was haunted. She said the city refused to shut it down. Too many political strings. But she admitted she avoided going there after dark. She told me, quietly, that whatever it was It seemed to wake up at night. Something about the building itself she believed was wrong. Cursed, maybe, or inhabited by something that didn't want to be seen. Despite her warning, I stayed for 2 more nights. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe stubbornness, or maybe because I needed to face whatever it was that had crept into my thoughts. On my final shift, I brought a camera, not to prove anything to anyone, but to prove it to myself. I set it up in the archive room and let it run while I cleaned. Nothing happened for hours, but right around 2 a.m, the power cut out, everything went black. My flashlight refused to turn on. My phone battery, though fully charged earlier, was dead. In the pitch darkness, I felt it again, that presence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was there, watching, breathing, close enough to touch. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited until the emergency lights flickered on. When they did, I was alone. No figure, no whisper, no shadow. But when I retrieved the camera the next morning and checked the footage, I saw something that haunts me to this day. For 2 full minutes, while I was out of frame, the camera had captured movement. A tall, thin silhouette emerging from the far end of the archive room, standing completely still for a moment. Then, slowly, methodically, it turned toward the camera and moved directly toward the lens. Just before it reached the frame, the screen turned to static. I deleted the footage and quit the job that afternoon. I didn't want answers anymore. I just wanted to forget. I haven't returned to that library since. I pass by it sometimes and it looks the same as ever. Quiet, old, forgotten by time. But I know better. I know there's something inside those walls. Something ancient and patient. It doesn't scream or chase. It waits, watches, rearranges books when no one is looking, breathes down your neck when your back is turned. I still dream about that place, and in those dreams the footsteps always get closer, and the whisper finally forms a word, but I always wake up before I can hear what it says. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some knowledge isn't meant to be heard. Or maybe it's just waiting until I return. Story 3. A few years ago, I rented a small guest house on the outskirts of a remote coastal town. I was a writer working on a novel and I wanted isolation, real, uninterrupted solitude. The town itself was quiet, its population small and mostly elderly. The guest house sat a few miles outside of town, nestled between the rolling dunes and the forest that separated the land from the crashing waves. The air always smelled of salt and pine, and the silence stretched for miles in every direction. The owner lived in the main house up the hill, and though she was kind, she respected my desire for space. For the first week, everything was idyllic. Mornings were filled with the cries of seagulls, afternoons with gentle winds, and nights with the soft lull of waves. I thought I had found the perfect place to finish my book. Until I started hearing the knocking. It began late one night. I was typing, the glow of my laptop casting soft light through the dim room. Everything was still. No music, no wind, no animals. Just the clack of keys. Then 3 sharp knocks. Not on the front door, not on the walls, but on the window behind me. I jumped, heart leaping into my throat, and spun around. The curtain was drawn, but the sound had been undeniable. I waited, frozen, listening for footsteps or more movement, but he must have really gone. But the night was quiet once again. I opened the curtain slowly, half expecting to see a raccoon or a tree branch, but nothing was there. Just the dark forest and my own reflection in the glass. I told myself it was probably just an animal brushing against the window. That was all. But the knocking returned the next night. Same window, same 3 knocks, always at 2:13 a.m. I started checking the clock. This time, I rushed outside with a flashlight, heart racing. I expected to find footprints, disturbed grass, anything that could explain what I'd heard, but the ground was untouched. The fog was thick and everything was unnervingly still. No wind, no movement, no sound, just silence and the weight of something unseen. I asked the landlady about it the next day. She looked down and hesitated, then said, "The guest house has always been a bit active." I laughed nervously, hoping she was joking, but her eyes didn't reflect humour. She didn't elaborate, just said it was old and things creak in the night. I wanted to believe that, but I had already seen the way her hands trembled when she said it. The third night changed everything. I decided I wouldn't run. I wouldn't hide. I would wait for the knocking. I sat by the window with all the lights off, eyes fixed on the glass. 2:13 came, and the knocking returned. 3 slow, deliberate taps, but this time I saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, standing just beyond the glass. I couldn't make out the face, only the outline of a head and shoulders, but it was there. Real. Not a shadow. Not my imagination. I lunged toward the window and yanked it open. The cold air hit me like a slap. The figure was gone. Vanished. No footsteps, no rustling, no signs of retreat. I stood there panting, my breath visible in the frigid air. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the outside of the window pane, 3 smudged handprints. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the kitchen with the lights on, staring at the door. My mind was a storm of logic and denial, trying to make sense of something that didn't want to be explained. When morning came, I walked to the main house and told the landlady I wanted to leave early. She nodded without surprise. She didn't ask why. She didn't try to convince me to stay. She simply said, "That's probably for the best." As I packed, I found something beneath my pillow. A piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I opened it with trembling fingers. It read, in handwriting that wasn't mine, "Don't look at the window." No signature, no explanation. I hadn't left the window open. I hadn't told anyone where I'd be sleeping. That note chilled me more than anything else. I left the guest house that afternoon and didn't look back. But the story doesn't end there. For weeks after returning home, I would wake up at exactly 2:13 a.m. every night. Not from dreams, just awake. My eyes would snap open and I'd lie there in bed, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. Then, one night, I heard it again. 3 knocks. This time not on a window, on the wall beside my bed. I jumped up, turned on every light, searched my apartment. Nothing. The following night, I stayed up with a camera pointed at the wall. At 2:13, the knocking came again, but the footage showed nothing. No movement, no sound. Just me, staring wide-eyed at the wall, while something I couldn't see made itself known. I started noticing other signs. Mirrors fogged when I hadn't used hot water, objects slightly moved from where I left them, and always that feeling of being watched, like someone or something was standing just behind me. I saw specialists. I spoke to a priest. I even had my apartment blessed. But nothing changed. The knocks continued, always 3, always at 2:13 a.m. I moved to a new apartment across town. The first night in the new place, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I had left it behind. But that night, the knocks came again. 3 slow taps on my bedroom window. No matter where I go, it follows. And the knocking never stops. I've learned to live with it now. I don't answer the knocks. I don't look out the window. I've blocked them all with thick curtains. I leave the lights on at night even though it doesn't help. And every morning I check for handprints. Some nights they're there, faint and smeared, as if someone was pressing their face to the glass while I slept. I don't know what it wants. It never speaks. It never breaks in. It only watches and knocks. I'm terrified of what would happen if I ever opened the window again. I don't want to know what it is. I just want it to stop. But it won't. It never does. Some say ghosts are echoes of the past. Others believe they are drawn to grief, fear, or guilt. But I think some are different. Some aren't lost souls. Some are things that wait. Things that notice when you notice them. Things that follow attention like a scent. Maybe I should have ignored the first knock. Maybe I should have left the curtain closed. But I didn't. I looked. And now it knows I saw it, and it's never let go since. Sometimes I imagine what might happen if I let it in. If I opened the door or answered the knock. But then I feel the weight of that unseen gaze pressing down on me. And I know, whatever it is, it's better left outside. Story 4. When I was 12 years old, my family moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a rural valley. The house had history, deep, old and strange. The previous owners had left in a hurry, though no one really talked about why. My parents were charmed by the idea of restoring something so rustic and full of character, while I, young and impressionable, was simply excited by the sprawling land and the distant sound of cows lowing across the fields. It was quiet out there, too quiet sometimes, the kind of silence that hums in your ears after a while. Our nearest neighbours were a mile away, and most days felt like we were alone on a floating island, surrounded by trees and wind. The house groaned and creaked in all the usual ways, but one part of it never felt quite right. The cellar door at the end of the hallway. It was an old wooden door with black iron hinges, its frame slightly crooked and swollen from decades of moisture and disuse. My father had padlocked it the day we moved in, saying the cellar was unsafe, too many loose boards and rotting stairs. That was fine by me. The door gave off a chill whenever I walked past it. It was always colder there, and the draft smelled like damp earth and something older, something I couldn't name. I started noticing things not long after we settled in. Small things, easily dismissed at first. Scratches near the base of the cellar door that hadn't been there before. Sounds, night tapping or the dragging of something heavy, coming from beneath the floorboards late at night. I would lie in bed, covers pulled to my chin, listening with wide eyes as the wind howled and the noises below grew louder. My parents didn't hear it, or maybe they didn't want to. I tried telling them, but they waved it off as my imagination. Old houses make noise, they'd say, but I knew the difference. This wasn't wood settling or pipes clanking. This was movement, intentional and slow, like someone pacing beneath the floor. I began avoiding that part of the hallway entirely, tiptoeing past the cellar door like it might swing open on its own. One morning, I found the padlock lying on the floor, not broken, just resting gently, as if it had been unlocked and set there. My father blamed the humidity for rusting the latch, but I could see the clean, unscratched metal where the lock had opened. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and backed away from the door, even as I felt the cold draft breathe across my feet. A few weeks later, I was home alone after school. My parents were both working late and the afternoon sun had already begun to fade behind the hills. I sat in the living room doing homework when I heard it again. A deep thud like something heavy had dropped just below me. Then the dragging sound returned. It moved from one side of the house to the other, slow and deliberate. I stood up, heart racing, and walked to the hallway. The cellar door was slightly open, just a crack, but enough to see blackness beyond it, a void that seemed too dark for daylight to touch. I called out, "Hello?" hoping I'd imagined it. The door creaked further open in response, revealing the top step descending into the gloom. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there as the cold poured out like fog. Then I heard it. A voice. Faint and dry, like leaves scraping against stone. It whispered my name. Just once. But that was enough. I slammed the door shut, locked it with shaking hands, and didn't move until my parents came home hours later. I told them everything. This time they believed me, if only because of the fear on my face. The next morning, my father went down into the cellar. He took a flashlight and crowbar and told us to wait upstairs. When he came back out, his face was pale. He didn't say much, just that there had been carvings in the dirt walls, symbols, strange ones, and a small wooden box buried in the far corner. He didn't open it. He didn't want to. He called a local contractor and had the cellar sealed that same week, concrete poured over the entire floor, and a heavy door bolted in place. After that, the sounds stopped. Years passed. We stayed in the house. Nothing strange happened again, but I never forgot. I would still glance at that sealed door every time I walked down the hallway, feeling the faint chill that never completely left. Eventually I grew up, moved out, and tried to forget. But some memories stay with you, don't they? Like shadows you carry. A few months ago I went back to visit my parents. The house was still there, aged and quiet, as if holding its breath. That night I stayed in my old room. Everything looked the same, the wallpaper, the creaky floor, even the old posters I'd never taken down. But the dream I had was new. I dreamed of the cellar door opening slowly, creaking wide to reveal a stairway that never ended, just spiraled deeper and deeper into black. In the dream I walked down those stairs. My hands brushed the walls, which were wet and warm. The air smelled of rot and soil. And then I saw it. The box my father had buried again, only now it was open. Inside, something moved. I couldn't see it clearly, only its shape. Long fingers, too many joints, eyes like marbles, just staring. I woke in a sweat, my heart racing. It was just a dream, but when I stepped out of bed the next morning, I noticed a trail of small, muddy footprints leading from the corner of my room to the hallway. No one believed me. They said I must have brought them in myself somehow. But I know better. Something had been there. Something had come up from beneath. I left that day and haven't gone back. My parents still live there. They say everything is quiet. They don't hear anything. But I can't stop thinking about that voice, about the whisper that knew my name. I wonder if sealing the cellar kept it trapped, or just made it angry. Maybe it waits in that dark, winding spiral, dreaming of the day someone else hears the knocking. Maybe it's patient. Maybe it doesn't forget. Maybe, just maybe, it followed me. Not in body, but in presence. Because sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I hear a faint whisper on the edge of sleep. It calls my name, just once, from beneath the floor. Story 5. During my final year of college, I shared an off-campus apartment with 2 other students. It was a cheap, aging duplex just beyond the tree line at the edge of town where the road became gravel and the houses turned scarce. The building was worn down but still livable. Faded yellow siding, cracked windows, and a sagging porch that creaked with every step. We were all too broke to care. Rent was low, utilities were included, and we convinced ourselves that the eerie quiet was a bonus. At first, it was even charming. We held movie nights, studied late, and laughed at how cliché the place felt, like it had been pulled straight out of a horror film. But beneath the jokes, we all felt something odd about the house, something that crept in just after dark and refused to leave. The first strange event came one night while we were all in the living room. The lights flickered. Not unusual, we figured. The wiring was old. But then the hallway light turned off completely. None of us were near the switch. My roommate Jake got up to check the breaker, only to find everything was still in place. When he returned, we noticed the living room clock had stopped. At exactly 11:11, we shrugged it off, made some nervous jokes, and forgot about it. But it happened again the next night, and the next. The same sequence. Flicker. Darkness. Clock frozen at 11:11 dot every single night. What was once amusing became unsettling. We tried replacing bulbs, batteries, even the clock itself. But no matter what we did, the moment returned, like clockwork. no pun intended. Then came the whispers. They started softly, like a distant radio playing through a wall. Faint, indecipherable murmurs. I first noticed them in the kitchen, late one night while washing dishes. At first I assumed it was the neighbours, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster and heard them clearly, not words but tones low and rhythmic, like chanting or humming. I called Jake over, and he heard it too. Our third roommate, Eliza, tried recording the sound, but nothing came through, just silence and static. The more we listened, the more it felt like the whispers were reacting to us, growing louder when we were quiet, vanishing when we spoke. It felt less like eavesdropping and more like being studied. We began noticing shadows that didn't belong, dark shapes in corners where light should have been, movements in our peripheral vision that disappeared when we turned to look. One night, while Eliza was home alone, every door in the apartment slammed shut at the same time. She ran out into the cold night barefoot, refusing to go back inside until we got home. After that, we kept our bedroom doors unlocked and slept with lights on. As the atmosphere changed, it was as if something had decided it was done hiding. I would wake up at night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Steady, soft, slow, like someone pacing back and forth outside my door. But when I opened it, the hallway would be empty. Always. The worst moment came on a rainy Thursday. I had stayed home sick while Jake and Eliza went to class. I was lying on the couch, bundled in blankets, half asleep. Then I heard it. 3 loud knocks at the front door. I got up, confused, thinking it was a delivery, but no one was there. I stepped onto the porch, looked around, even walked out into the rain. Nothing. Just the sound of dripping gutters and distant thunder. When I turned back, I froze. In the center of the living room floor, soaking wet, were footprints. Bare. Human. They led from the door to the hallway, then vanished. No trail leading back. No sign of anyone. Just those wet prints drying slowly into the floorboards. We called the landlord, who claimed the previous tenant had moved out without notice. When we pressed him, he admitted she had been a little off and talked about voices in the house. She eventually left in the middle of the night, leaving all her belongings behind. We asked to see the basement, which had always been locked. He reluctantly agreed. We descended the stairs together, flashlight in hand, and found a cold, narrow room with stone walls and a dirt floor. In one corner was a strange set of markings carved into the stone. Circles, lines, and symbols none of us recognized. They looked old, worn. The landlord paled when he saw them, muttering that he had never noticed those before. We left quickly. He never followed up, and we never returned to the basement again. Over the next few weeks, the house grew colder, not physically, but emotionally. It felt like the walls were leaning in, like the house itself was paying attention. Eliza moved out first, unable to sleep through the voices anymore. Jake followed soon after, claiming he saw someone standing at the foot of his bed, just staring. I stayed the longest, part stubbornness, part disbelief, but the final straw came when I found a note on my bedroom desk. It was written in my handwriting. Only I hadn't written it. It simply read, "It's not the house, it's you." I left that same day and never returned. We broke our lease. The landlord didn't ask questions. In fact, he seemed relieved. Years later, I drove past that old duplex out of curiosity. It looked the same, maybe a bit more run down, but the windows were still dark, the porch still sagging. There was a new "For Rent" sign out front, faded and crooked. I wondered who might move in next. If the house still watched, if the voices still whispered. Some places aren't haunted in the traditional sense. They're not just filled with ghosts or memories. Some places seem to become sentient, gathering fragments of every person who's ever lived within them, observing, learning, waiting. I don't know if what we experienced was a haunting or something worse, but I do know this: when a house begins to recognize you, it's time to leave. I never finished college. I transferred to an online program, completed my degree from a new city, and buried the memories deep. But even now, in moments of silence, I sometimes hear the whisper again. Not in my home, not in my ears, but in my mind, a familiar hum, low and knowing, as if something is still trying to reach me, as if a piece of that house is still inside me, echoing. And when the clock stops at 11:11, I don't breathe. I don't move. I simply wait, counting the seconds, praying the moment will pass without a knock at the door. Story 6. To job last winter as an overnight security guard for an art museum located in a quiet part of the city. The hours were strange, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., but the pay was decent and the work was simple. Just walk the halls every hour, check cameras and make sure no one broke in or tampered with any of the exhibits. Most nights were uneventful, just me, the dim lights, and the distant hum of the heating vents echoing through the museum's massive stone halls. I carried a flashlight and a radio, but I rarely used either. The building was elegant, but eerily silent after hours, filled with the quiet stillness only old structures seemed to hold. It didn't take long for that stillness to begin feeling like something more, a silence that pressed against my thoughts like a weight. There was one wing I never liked patrolling, the antiquities section. It held ancient artifacts, stone masks, bone tools and ceremonial items from civilizations long gone. Something about that wing always felt heavy. The temperature dropped noticeably as soon as I stepped through its archway, and the air smelled faintly of dust and iron. I joked with the other guards that it felt cursed, but they didn't laugh. One of the older guards, Don, told me to keep my patrols brief in that section. When I asked why, he simply said, "Some things don't like being watched." I thought he was kidding, until the night I saw the mask. It was displayed in a glass case at the center of the room, a stone carving of a human face distorted into a wide exaggerated grin. Its eyes were hollow, wide open, and its teeth looked more like jagged shards than anything human. That night, as I passed by the mask, I noticed something strange. The glass case had fogged slightly from the inside, like someone had breathed on it. I stared at it for a moment, puzzled, before wiping the outside glass. My hand left a clean streak, but the fog remained untouched inside the case. I radioed it in, thinking maybe the temperature control had malfunctioned, but when maintenance came the next day, everything was in perfect order. No leaks, no faults, no explanation. The following night, I approached the mask again, flashlight in hand. The glass was clear, but the mask had shifted. Not much, just a few inches to the left, I was sure of it. I'd memorized its position, the way its features faced forward. Now it was tilted slightly toward the hallway I stood in, like it was watching me leave. I checked the security footage. Nothing, not a single frame out of place. The mask never moved, but it had. I knew it. I started to dread my patrols. The cameras never picked up anything unusual, but things continued to happen. I'd find the lights in the antiquities wing flickering randomly. Cold spots would appear suddenly, vanishing just as fast. And sometimes, when I passed by the glass case, I would hear something faint, not a voice exactly, more like breathing. Soft, raspy and rhythmic. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it. But the more I tried to act normal, the worse it got. The mask became more lifelike, its grin wider, its eyes darker. One night, I swear its lips were parted just slightly, revealing more teeth than before. And then came the dream. I was alone in the museum, walking the halls like always. But the lights were out. My flashlight wouldn't work. The only light came from the antiquities wing. I walked toward it, and the moment I crossed into the room, the temperature plummeted. The mask was no longer in its case. It was on the pedestal, hovering in the air. Slowly it turned to face me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. It whispered something in a language I didn't understand. The whisper echoed in my ears, deep and sharp like glass scraping across stone. I woke in a cold sweat, the sound still ringing in my head. That morning I called in sick. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that place. When I returned the following night, I tried to avoid the Antiquities wing altogether. I did my patrols quickly, kept the cameras running, and told myself everything was fine. But then, just before 3 a.m., the alarms went off. Motion detected in the Antiquities wing. I rushed there with a sinking feeling. The lights were dim, the air colder than usual. I entered the room, and every single display case was empty. Every artifact, every mask, gone. I stood frozen, unsure of what I was seeing. Then, slowly, the lights flickered back to full brightness, and everything was back in place, as if nothing had moved. I checked the cameras. The feed for that wing was corrupted, just static and flickers. Every other camera worked fine. I told Don what had happened. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "It's choosing you now." I asked him what he meant, but he refused to say more. Just handed me a small wooden talisman and said, "Keep this on you, always." I wore it from that night forward, and things quieted down, at least for a while. But the mask kept watching. Every night, it faced me a little more directly, its grin a little wider, the breathing louder. I stopped looking into the case altogether. I'd passed the room quickly, head down, heart pounding. Eventually I transferred to another location. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed a fresh start. But the fear didn't leave with me. Months later, I visited a museum in another city, just passing time during a business trip. I wandered into an exhibit on ancient South American rituals, and there it was. The mask, the same twisted grin, the same hollow eyes, not a replica, the exact same mask. The plaque said it had never left that city, that it had been donated over a decade ago, but I knew it. I felt it. I turned to leave, and in the glass reflection I thought I saw it tilt toward me, ever so slight. I haven't been to a museum since. I avoid antiques. I avoid dimly lit corridors. And I keep the talisman in my pocket at all times. But some nights, I still dream of dark halls, flickering lights, and the sound of breath behind glass. Story 7. My grandmother's house was the kind of place you only visit in dreams or nightmares. A tall, narrow structure at the edge of a quiet lake. It stood among weeping trees and soft, moss-covered stones, where the world always seemed a little darker, a little quieter. She lived there alone after my grandfather passed, refusing to leave despite the house's age and creeping decay. As a child, I loved visiting her, enchanted by her stories, her old record player, and the way the wind rustled through the shutters. But as I grew older, I started to notice things. Small, subtle things, like the way the house never warmed properly, no matter how strong the fire burned, or how the second-floor hallway always seemed to stretch longer when I walked it at night. It wasn't haunted in the usual sense, it was something else, something older than memory. The attic was strictly off-limits. She never said why, only that it was not meant for children. It had a steep, narrow door at the end of the upstairs hallway, and even as an adult, I never saw her open it. But at night, I would sometimes hear creaks coming from above, soft, pacing footsteps and the occasional sound of something being dragged slowly across wood. My grandmother would pretend she didn't hear it, even when the noise grew loud enough to wake me. "Old house," she'd say with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They settle, they sigh. But I knew the difference between the voice of a house and the sound of someone or something moving overhead. Still, I never pushed her. I respected her silence the way one respects a sleeping animal, careful, quiet, and a little afraid of what might happen if you wake it. It was only after she passed that I finally saw inside. I returned to the house to help clean and prepare it for sale. It felt empty without her, the silence too absolute, like the house itself was mourning. I wandered through each room, brushing dust from old furniture, folding blankets that still carried her scent, and sorting through photos of a life lived in quiet mystery. Eventually I stood before the attic door. The key was still in her drawer, wrapped in an old handkerchief. I took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, feeling that strange stretch of hallway pull at my steps. The key turned easily, the lock clicking open with a weightless sound, and the door creaked inward to reveal the darkness beyond. A single pull-string light swayed gently from the ceiling, casting long shadows over the room's contents. The attic wasn't filled with the junk I expected. No boxes, no furniture. Just a single rocking chair in the center of the floor, positioned beneath the light and facing a mirror propped against the far wall. The air was stale but not dusty, too clean, too still. As I stepped inside, I felt something strange settle over me, a heaviness in my chest, like the room itself was watching. I walked slowly toward the chair, and as I did, the mirror caught my reflection. But something was wrong. I was moving, but my reflection wasn't. It sat motionless in the chair, staring straight at me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, stepped left, then right. My reflection didn't follow. It simply sat there, smiling faintly, eyes locked on mine with a familiarity that chilled me deeper than any ghost ever could. I backed away, but the room didn't feel like it let me go. It was as if I had stepped into something timeless, an echo, maybe, or a memory that had taken on form. I left the attic, locked the door, and didn't return. That night, as I lay in my childhood room, I heard the creaking begin again. But this time, it wasn't from above. It was from the hallway. Soft, rhythmic steps, pacing back and forth outside my door. I held my breath and watched the shadow under the frame stretch and flicker like candlelight. I didn't sleep. When morning finally came, I opened the door to find nothing but silence and a single handprint on the attic door, too high to have been mine, pressed deep into the wood like a burn. I left the house that day. I called an estate manager and asked them to handle the rest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house hadn't wanted me there. Or maybe it had, and now it knew me. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget, but the dreams came anyway, always the same. I'd walk through the house, each room darker than the last, until I reached the attic, and there in that dim circle of light sat the reflection. Now no longer still, it would rise, smile, and beckon me closer. I always woke before I reached it, drenched in sweat and whispering my grandmother's name. One night, I found a photo in an old album I hadn't noticed before. It showed her as a young woman, sitting in that same attic chair. Behind her, in the mirror, was the same faint figure I had seen. I burned the photo. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Desperation. But it didn't help. The dreams continued. Sometimes I would see the reflection in other mirrors, storefronts, bathroom glass, even in the dark shine of a turned-off screen. Just for a second, never moving, never blinking, but always there, watching, waiting. I started covering mirrors in my apartment, avoided looking at my own reflection too long, and kept the lights on through the night. Friends thought I was just grieving. Maybe I was, maybe I still am, but I know what I saw. I know what followed me from that attic, and I know it's still with me. They say mirrors reflect the soul, that they capture moments, but what if they trap more than that? What if they remember what was once seen? What if every mirror in that house held on to the image of something that wanted to be remembered, wanted to escape? My grandmother had lived there for over 60 years. Who knows what she saw, what she let in? I think she kept it at bay somehow, contained it. I understood it in a way I never could. But now she's gone, and I fear whatever was behind that reflection no longer has to stay where it was. It knows me now, and I think it wants to trade places. Some nights, I stand in the hallway and stare at the mirror at the end. I make sure it shows what it's supposed to, but every so often I catch a flicker, a glitch, a version of myself still sitting in that attic chair, still smiling, still waiting for me to step closer. I won't. I don't know what happens if I do, but I fear that once I cross that threshold, there's no coming back. So I avoid mirrors, I avoid memory, and I speak my grandmother's name before I sleep, hoping her spirit still lingers somewhere in the corners of that ancient house, keeping watch over the thing that stares through the glass and remembers the sound of my footsteps. Story 8. I used to work as an overnight dispatcher for a small-town fire department tucked deep in the Appalachian foothills. The job was mostly uneventful, lots of waiting, quiet hours in the dark, watching over radio channels, monitoring weather reports, and making sure the night passed without chaos. Most of the calls came during the day, but every now and then something strange would come through in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. It wasn't always clear what made it strange, just that the voice on the other end didn't sound quite right, or the static on the line had a rhythm that made your skin crawl. My supervisor, a grizzled man named Roy, told me to ignore those calls. "You'll hear a few of them now and then," he said, sipping black coffee. "Let 'em go. Don't log it, don't answer twice." At first, I thought he was just being superstitious, the way people in small towns pass around local legends. But then I took one of those calls myself. It came in at 3:42 a.m., just as the wind outside started howling and the lights dimmed briefly. The caller ID showed unknown. I answered like I always did, calm, professional, precise. What I heard on the other end made me go still. It was a woman's voice, whispering in a tone that sounded both close and impossibly far away. She kept repeating one sentence: "He's in the walls," over and over. No variation, no panic, just calm, steady repetition. I asked who was speaking. She didn't respond. I asked for her address. Still nothing but that one phrase. Then the line went dead, as if it had never existed. I checked the logs. No number, no recording. Nothing had been captured. It was as if the call had never happened at all. I told Roy the next morning, and he just looked at me, eyes hollow like he'd heard that same sentence too many times before. "Don't chase it," he warned. "That's how they get in." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. But the memory stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, the station grew colder at night, not physically, emotionally. I'd sit alone in the dispatch room and feel like someone else was in the building, not moving, just watching. The kind of presence that doesn't announce itself but lingers, just enough to turn the air stale. I stopped turning off the lights. I started keeping the radio volume lower, afraid of what might bleed through again. One night, I was halfway through my shift when I heard footsteps down the hall. Heavy boots, deliberate pace, but I knew I was the only one on the overnight roster. I called out, no answer. I stepped out with my flashlight and checked every room. Empty. I returned to the dispatch chair, only to find the radio had turned itself on. Static poured through it, but beneath the crackle, I heard it again, the same woman's voice. "He's in the walls." Only this time it was followed by something new. A second voice. A deeper one. Not whispering, but humming. Slow, low, tuneless. I turned the radio off, pulled the plug. But the hum didn't stop. It kept going, coming not from the device, but from the walls themselves. That was when I saw the dent in the drywall. A shallow bulge near the baseboard, as if something had pressed outward from inside. It hadn't been there earlier. I backed away, heart racing, and stared at it for a long time. Then the lights flickered again. I left the room, sat in my car, waited for sunrise. When Roy came in, I quit, just handed him my badge and said nothing. He didn't ask. He just nodded and said, "Good. You lasted longer than most." That was the last time I set foot in that dispatch center. But the story doesn't end there. A few months later, I was sleeping in my new apartment when I woke suddenly to a sound, humming, low, familiar. It was coming from the vent near the floor. I pressed my ear to it and froze. A whisper just beneath the hum. "He's in the walls." I bolted upright and turned every light on in the apartment. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day I called a friend in HVAC to inspect the ductwork. He found nothing. No animals, no gaps. Just an odd amount of static interference on his handheld equipment. He couldn't explain it. I didn't press him. I started avoiding silence altogether. Kept music playing softly in every room. Left the TV on even when I wasn't watching. But late at night, when the volume dipped just low enough, I'd hear it. The hum, the whisper, and sometimes something even worse. A shuffling, like dry fingernails against plaster. I started seeing things too. At first, just glimpses. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. A shape reflected in a darkened screen. Then shadows in places shadows shouldn't be. High on the wall, reaching across the ceiling, moving without a source. My dreams became feverish. I'd find myself standing in an endless hallway, the walls pulsing, breathing in and out. The humming would build until it was unbearable, and I'd wake to find my ears ringing, nose bleeding. I moved apartments again. Didn't leave a forwarding address, didn't tell anyone. Just packed in the middle of the night and drove 6 hours to a different state. For a while it helped. I found peace. I slept soundly. I believed it was finally over. But a few weeks ago, I woke up to static playing from my phone. It had turned on by itself. I picked it up with trembling hands and checked the recent calls. There was one placed at 3:42, AIM to unknown. I didn't answer it, but a voicemail had been left. I played it, expecting silence. Instead, I heard it again, the woman's voice. "He's in the walls." Just once. Clear, crisp, final. Then came the, and underneath it, barely audible, was the sound of nails dragging slowly across dry wall. I threw the phone away, bought a new one, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I still hear it vibrating faintly, and when I press my ear to the wall, there's warmth on the other side. And breath. I've since stopped telling people about it. They don't understand. They suggest doctors, sleep studies, mental health assessments, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know what followed me out of that dispatch room. Some signals aren't meant to be answered. Some calls come from deeper places than we're equipped to comprehend. They don't ask for help. They don't seek rescue. They seek attention. And once you've given it, once you've listened, they know your frequency, they find you. And once they're in the walls, they never really leave. So, if you ever hear a voice whispering late at night, telling you something that makes no sense, don't answer, don't ask questions, and above all, don't listen twice.